Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am R. Indira, formerly Professor of Sociology at the University of Mysore and paper coordinator for the course Education and Society. My presentation is based on the module Education, Economy and Society in India between 1947 and 1991. This module is written by Dr. K.G. Gayatri Devi, formerly Faculty, Institute of Social and Economic Change, Bengaluru. The module basically tries to trace the history of education in the background of social, political and economic developments that took place in the country even before India became independent. Because once the country became independent, education was seen as the true harbinger of social change, and a lot of hope was rested on education as the instrument that would set right inequalities in the country. The country inherited several problems in the wake of the partition, and poverty was the main problem. And given the fact that this is a country with diversities and people of different socio-economic backgrounds lived here, education was in fact seen as a tool that could set right these inequalities. So the module traces the growth of education at different levels and the factors that influenced this growth at different points of time. So it gives us an introduction to the growth of the education system in India after the country became independent in 1947 and the role that it played in ushering in the country's economic development. It is presupposed that the socio-economic conditions prevailing in a society tend to have a bearing on the nature and progress of the educational subsystem. In any country, education is a state subject and hence tends to be structured by the political system based on an ideology and course of action. As a society transforms itself, its educational functions not only undergo change but in most cases influence and decide the path and pace of such changes. For example, in ancient India, educational system was based on spiritual and religious norms and acquired a scientific character. As years went by, religion played an important role in guiding the Indian society and especially its educational system, emphasizing upon self-realization. Gradually, the surrounding economic and political systems underwent changes due to many historical reasons and happenings. Education in ancient India. Society in ancient India rested much upon religious dictates and writings. The Vedas and Upanishads were in themselves religious texts said to have a divine origin and established education on epistemological and philosophical grounds. The system also had a number of omissions such as discrimination against some citizens on grounds of caste and gender. The urge to search for the ultimate truth reigned over other pursuits of education in this age where the students stayed with the teacher, offering devoted services to him who was considered an epitome of all knowledge, ideals, tradition and ritualistic practices. But the pupils received knowledge and skills based on their birth into caste and subcaste groups that determined their occupation and life itself. Economy was innate in this form of educational learning where social values gained over materialistic accomplishments and where spiritualism led human life towards greater achievement. The Rigveda insisted upon brahmacharya, yagna and dana. Through these, the proper ways and means of materialistic attainments were further taught in the Atharva and Yajur Vedas. Buddhist education that came next also placed importance upon monastic life and achieving true and ultimate knowledge with truth and sacrifice of personal comforts as guiding principles to attain good education. The monasteries succeeded in going beyond caste-based inequalities and even set out to preach secular education under religious and philosophical instructions. The Muslim invasions in the 8th century AD and much later the Mughal rule was characterized by propagation of Islamic education. Education under the British, the scenario prior to 1947. The policies of the British during the years before independence are generally blamed for the poor state of affairs of India's economy and society after the country gained independence. Having arrived in the late 17th century, the British, through their East India Company, took complete hold over the rural economy led by agriculture and allied occupations. Historians have argued that India on the eve of the arrival of the British was self-sufficient, and what is more, due to the Mughals, it had reached relatively better political stability. There was a uniform revenue policy and a well-developed countrywide trade network, but its agriculture was still predominantly traditional, leading to a conventional and caste-based social system with hierarchy of occupations and therefore a hierarchy of stratification of individuals or groups. Caste was cut across by class distinctions, leading to a complex social organization where economic, political, and other attributes were defined strongly by social considerations. Literacy obviously was absent or unaffordable to low castes, in particular to castes in the lower rungs of the hierarchy, indigenous communities, Dalits, and women. Yet the country was described by travelers as contributing up to 60 to 70% of the global GDP along with China. Such was its economy based on barter, where the servicing artistic and professional castes received annually food grains in return for the products they manufactured and sold to other communities or for their services to the latter. The administration was by the British, and they received a share of the agricultural produce as revenue produced by tenant cultivators for their zamindars under an economy that was predominantly subsistence agriculture, where primitive technology was used. The Marathas, who succeeded the Mughals, brought in an integrated India, bringing together its northern, western, central, and some of the southern parts under one rule, soon to be disintegrated into several petty kingdoms, some prosperous and others basically conflict and poverty ridden. The real boost to education during the British rule began with the announcement of the Charter Act of 1813, when the Christian missionaries insisted upon undertaking mass literacy, although it was characterized by dual opinions by Charles Grant that such education must be in English and contain lessons on the principles of Christian religion versus those of Minto, who felt that education for Indians should be in their own culture and classics. The feeling of understanding between the missionaries and the British officials, which viewed education in India as an act of charity, subsequently led to the Wood's Educational Dispatch of 1854. Several steps followed with the dispatch, such as formation of departments of public instruction in the 5 provinces of Bengal, Madras, Bombay, Northwestern Province, and Punjab, initiating the process for setting up of universities in Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, grading system, grants to educational institutions, private education, training to teachers, absorbing meritorious Indians into teaching positions, primary, secondary, and female education, and a new educational policy. Profile of society, an economy on the eve of withdrawal of British rule. Extreme poverty, misery, and destitution of farmers and workers were the order of the day. Frequent famines rooted out landless families, which were more affected by the policies of the rulers to curb rural arts, crafts, cottage industries, and handlooms, till they were put in place by the Charter of 1813. But this only resulted in and benefited the colonial rulers and their country because large sums of capital reached England, leading to severe revenue drain in domestic economy. The net result was an economy that was sluggish, poorest in the world, weak agriculture, largely illiterate population, inadequate commercial infrastructure, and large-scale unskilled labor force. While this is what we inherited on the eve of our independence, the impact of the Second World War was also not less. We all know that historically India opened the doors of its Gurukulas, which were ancient centers of learning, to only upper caste children, in particular to Brahmin boys. This was a traditional Hindu practice tailored to meet the needs of a group that was expected to preach and instruct others. The colonial administration did little or nothing to alter this discriminatory system, where only upper class, upper caste, and elitist families were able to provide education to their boys through the European schools. Education was not accessible to all sections of society due to the operation of both caste and within each because of class. In course of time, this practice became or turned out to be a strategy for seeking upward mobility by those low in the caste ladder. Those with the required economic resources tried to get into these expensive schools. The beneficiaries were largely the upper castes and Brahmins, who were enabled by this education to seek jobs in the British administration and westernize their lifestyles. This gatekeeper character of education under the British led to class formation in a strong manner, adding to the already existing strong caste-based inequality. Education not only was an instrument of achieving growth and improvement in the quality of life by the various aspirant caste groups, but it was also used as an instrument to segregate one caste or subcaste from the other. It became not only a leveler of social change, but also of social mobility of one caste over another. The value and use of education, that is English education, as a passport to economic and political power, came to be clearly established with the Constitution of India, guaranteeing access to education to all, irrespective of caste, creed, sex, religion, or region. What is more, the depressed caste classes and Adivasis, as they were addressed in the pre-independence days, came to avail of reservation of seats in educational institutions on the basis of the quota system, or what is also known as the system of protective discrimination or positive discrimination. This happened largely during the mid-20th century. Efforts to popularize education after independence. India's socio-economic profile is deeply historical and unfolds from being an impoverished country to being the most competent global economy, standing as a model for many growing societies. It has a complex political and economic history, particularly preceding independence under the British Raj, that extended to a little more than 200 years, culminating in the country's independence in the year 1947. After becoming a sovereign democratic nation, it was confronted by several problems, prominent being its mass illiteracy, poverty, compounded both and resulted from not only class inequalities but from traditional caste-based social inequality, which arose due to the hierarchy of occupations, grouping individuals based on their birth into specific caste groups. Hence, the planners set out to establish a socialistic pattern of society through economic growth focused upon achieving self-reliance, justice for all, and eradication of the most pressing of its problems, that is poverty. The challenge was to accomplish these under a clear democratic framework of political system in a society that was extremely heterogeneous in terms of religion, caste, region, language, and culture, just to mention a few. When India stood at the threshold of attaining its independence from colonial rule, it was faced with a multitude of challenges. It adopted a 5-year development plan almost influenced by Soviet Russia and set out to improve infrastructure, agricultural production, healthcare, and education. The planning process came under the latter's influence and tended to be protective of its citizens and believed in a centralized planning process. At the end of the colonial rule, India was still one of the poorest in the world and grouped one among the third world countries or known as an underdeveloped country. Its poor economy was also characterized by mass illiteracy and a migrant rural population that was largely unskilled and impoverished. Nearly 93% of its population lived in villages. It was industrialization and growing trade and markets that initiated a slow process of urban expansion and development of towns and cities. Planning for a free nation with an able economy, polity and equal society was initiated, investing deep trust in the nature and content of the plans. The setting up of the Planning Commission and launching of the 5-year plans were the first steps in this direction. It was believed that basic education, in Amartya's words, gives way for widespread economic participation and creation of social opportunities for the poor, helping to remove some of the barriers to economic development. The challenging task of popularizing English education was taken up soon after independence through several policies and programs implemented at both central and state levels. Needless to emphasize, the push to this move had been received in the pre-independence era itself by the British to cater to mainly the needs of the administrative staff of the East India Company. This step rather succeeded in laying the foundation for formal education in India. What is more, many in the country began to look forward to access better opportunities for employment using this new education as a passport. The economy of India has grown steadily in the last 70 years, enabling the country to emerge as the 7th largest in nominal GDP and 3rd largest in its purchasing power parity. There are many accomplishments on the economic side of the country's development. New industrialized country, one of the G20 major economies, a member of the BRICS, and a developing economy, to name a few. It is the fastest growing economy of the world from mid-2014, thereby replacing China. This and many other accomplishments of the nation are attributed to its service sector in a major way, as it has contributed to an annual growth rate of above 9% from 2001 and achieving 57% GDP in 2012-2013. The credit for this goes in a substantial manner to its educated population, especially and notably to its English educated population. The country is able to offer BPO services, produce and export IT products and IT enabled services. Primary and middle school education. Present system of education was introduced by the British in India in the 19th century. It was recommended by Lord Macaulay and was Western in style and content. After independence, education became the responsibility of the states and the central government. It was in 1964 that the Education Commission was set up with 16 members, of whom 5 were of foreign origin. As per the recommendations of this commission, a constitutional amendment was brought in for making education the responsibility of both the state and central governments. Indian economy suffered severely during the early 1990s due to growing inflation, unemployment, poverty and low foreign exchange reserve. Debts from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were raising, and the country took steps towards liberalization and privatization that helped to reform the Indian economy. These reforms affected tariff levels, exchange rate policies, industrial licensing policy, besides relaxing India's foreign direct investment. This resulted in 3 major changes in the country's overall growth: increased foreign direct investment, increased knowledge base, particularly in information technology, and heightened domestic consumption due to a growing middle class. The most outstanding outcome of the above change is noticeable in the expanding opportunities for knowledge seeking through education. The growth of the information technology industry is supported by a good and efficient education system from primary to higher education, creating a highly talented technical workforce. India has picked up most of the outsourcing from Western countries and several of its talented young men and women are diaspora now residing in these countries as IT professionals. Needless to emphasize, at the base of all this development and expansion is its strong and highly dedicated educational services. In a bid to popularize education, that is primary education, and to enable it to reach all the children irrespective of their rural, tribal or urban residence, the government has taken several significant steps or measures right from the time the Constitution came into being in 1950. The first 5-year plan embarked upon promoting primary education and to revamp the existing structure of such education. The Planning Commission also supported the cause by encouraging teachers' training to see an improvement in their teaching standards. The Committee of Members of Parliament on Education brought out 2 important educational policies at the national level in 1968 and in 1986, keeping the directive principles of state policy and Article 45 of the Constitution that envisaged free and compulsory education for all children up to the age of 14 years. This led to improvements in the educational scenario with the establishment of more numbers of such schools and rise in the students' intake in these schools. This referred to the number of students from vulnerable categories of society such as the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, minorities and women. Out of school children. According to an estimate, 1 out of every 3 out of the school child is from India. Before the commencement of the 5th plan, the government realized that school enrollment is not reaching the optimum level due to a high rate of dropping out of children from schools. A majority of students drop out even before they reach high school or worse, before they complete primary school. Poverty of the parents and lack of resources to send children to school are the predominant causes of this malady. Several measures were undertaken to address this situation, such as providing free textbooks, scholarships to deserving students, noon meal program, enrollment of girls, adult education to motivate parents to keep their wards in schools, and increasing the ratio of women teachers in the schools with a high rate of girls students. Constraint to education, caste, class and gender. Caste-based discrimination. Although the Constitution has provided equal opportunities to all to access the benefits of schooling and education, owing to social stratification, in reality there is no equality. Caste-based oppression and social exclusion are important in arresting or preventing Dalits and children of castes placed in lower social strata from utilizing the facilities for schooling. Rural-urban differences. Despite large-scale influx of occupations in urban areas, modern gadgets and lifestyle, rural areas are still lagging behind in encouraging education of children, particularly of those from the weaker sections, which includes SCs and STs and girl children. Girls' education. Girls' education has still remained a challenge due to social biases against it. Gender bias against sending the daughter to the school begins from home and is supported by the prevailing cultural ethos in the community. Large family size caused by the birth of more number of children, often girl children due to son preference, puts many parents in a situation when they choose to send a son to school in preference to a daughter because they live in an illusion that investment on a son's education has future rewards. Early marriage of girls is yet another cause of school dropout by girl children, and this practice cuts across the barriers of caste, class, religion and regional boundaries in its strict imposition, particularly in rural areas where conservatism largely prevails. Poverty of parents. Poverty at the household level. Women-headed families, families of landless laborers who are often migratory for want of livelihood opportunities, large family size due to son preference, illiteracy of parents, unemployment and underemployment, very low and inconsistent income, declining agricultural productivity, natural disasters, all these act in a variety of ways in curbing the educational progress of children. Growth of higher education in India after independence. Some of the efforts made by the government during the period 1947 to 1991 to support and regulate the growth of higher education through the formation of policies and allocation of resources are discussed in the following section. The University Grants Commission. The Government of India appointed the University Grants Commission as early as in 1952 with a statutory position to develop and expand higher education in the country. It is responsible for distributing financial grants to all central, state and deemed universities after a needs assessment. Today, more than 38,000 colleges with 28 million students enrolled under 726 universities come under the UGC's purview. The UGC is striving to achieve a steady and progressive knowledge economy in the country with equity and sustainability in human resource development. It has come a long way from 1956 when there were about 20 universities and 500 colleges with 0.21 million students. The UGC Act stands amended 3 times up to 1985, and now under the new government from May 2014 it is being amended further to meet the growing needs of the ambitious knowledge economy. The All India Council for Technical Education. The All India Council for Technical Education was established in 1948 and attained statutory status in 1988 in order to improve the status of technical education in the country. All technical training institutions, engineering colleges, and even private professional colleges fall under its purview. Distance Education Council. In order to give vent to the needs of those students who can't attend a formal school, the government established the IGNOU or the Indira Gandhi National Open University in 1985 through an Act of Parliament. It was intended to promote quality distance education at the national level and also to set up and coordinate the work of various open universities and distance education councils. In the last decade of the 20th century, the nature of economic growth in the country clearly started laying the tracks for the ways in which the educational system was expected to respond. One of the greatest challenges was the entry of the private sector into the field of education and the consequent shifts that started taking place in the nature of courses, student composition, and the teaching learning methodologies. The state was confronted with the task of evolving both policies and programs to meet the challenge emerging from the entry of new players as well as an expanding network of stakeholders in the field of education. The developments that took place in the field of education in India between 1947 and 1991, the period covered in this module, were closely influenced by the kind of developments that took place in the country prior to 1947. A formal system of education was introduced by the British, but the object of this education was not to train a class of leaders, but a group of masses that followed orders. The country after independence also faced several problems, yet the planning process that was started in the 1950s and the different schemes and programs that were started by both central and state governments, and the constitution itself, which mandated that equal educational opportunities must be provided, set the stage for the development of a very massive educational program that influenced the country in the years to come.